Here's the thing from a Mets perspective that bothers me a little bit. And there's many different ways to win. You can go sign Jackie Bradley Jr. and take those financial commitments that you would have given George Springer and allocate that money someplace else. That's fair. You can do that, and you can still win. So it's not a case of there was just one path for the Mets to go and win. With that being said, here's the dialogue I am bothered by. I can hear now that, well, we didn't sign George Springer because we had to make a choice between Springer and Conforto conceptually. We want to sign Michael Conforto, so would you rather have Conforto long-term or would you rather have George Springer long-term? Well, number one is there's no guarantee. It's an if of whether or not you're going to sign Michael Conforto. That's not a guarantee. You'd love to sign him. I love Michael Conforto as a player, but Scott Boras is his agent. Scott Boras likes to take his players to free agency to test the market, and Scott Boras would also have his players play in the North Pole if they're going to get every single last dollar. So, there's no guarantee you're signing Michael Conforto. I get the idea of locking up your own players long-term, but mind you, we went into this marketplace this offseason for the Mets where there were four big players, Lindor, JT Realmuto, Trevor Bauer, and George Springer, right? Those were the four players, 3 free agents, 1 via trade. And the thought was that the Mets were conceivably going to get 2 of those 4, right? Initially, you thought it was Bauer. Then you thought it was Realmuto. Then you got wind that they were hot on the heels of George Springer. They decide not to go to 150 for Springer, where their number was a tad over $20 million per year, and the Blue Jays came in at $25 million per year for George Springer. Mind you, the Mets still have a need for center fielder. Don't give me the rationalization, though, and it bothers me that, well, we didn't pursue Springer because now we have more financial flexibility to go sign Michael Conforto and other Mets to long-term deals. That's nice, but that's a big-time if. That is not a certainty.
Yeah, you're right. And with Scott Boras being Conforto's agent, even though Conforto does mean so much to this team, not just that he's a homegrown guy, but he's like the player rep, and he, was the first person to talk when the Black Lives Matter movement came out, and the Mets players, put a Black Lives Matter jersey over home plate and left the field. Conforto in the post-game press conference was the first person to speak on behalf of the Mets organization. These are big things where a guy's influence on the team is much more than just what he puts out on the field. So I think Conforto, the Mets certainly would have the inside track on re-signing Conforto. To me, I didn't look at it as this not signing Springer was just because they need to keep the vault open for Michael Conforto. I looked at this and said the Mets made their big move the moment they traded for Lindor and Carlos Carrasco was in that trade. Because that's when I think the Mets signified, okay, we got Francisco Lindor is one of the top 5 players in the sport. We also addressed a need pitching-wise there, which made you think it took them out of Bauer. And they basically plugged 2 holes there. Now listen, Jared Porter is an all-time world-class creep. He was right about the fact that the Mets need depth. And the fact that they're not going to put $25 million a year to George Springer, I know Springer is so supremely talented and how much he would elevate the team. I'm not denying that. But if you can use those resources to plug some holes for the Mets, I think that's a great strategy. I do. I don't have a problem with this. I really don't. As a Met fan, I look at myself and ask this question. Would I have rather them sign Springer or traded for Lindor and also getting Carrasco? And the answer to me is Lindor and Carrasco, even as painful as it was to give up Andrés Giménez. So I'm not that disappointed today. I know I'm maybe in the minority of Mets fans. I don't know if I'm in the minority, but I feel like the Mets are putting together an extremely competitive team. And honestly, for the Blue Jays, there were other things that I think pushed them to that $25 million a year number with George Springer that the Mets may not have been willing to go to. Number one, they as great as their young core is, and they are like a sneaky, maybe sleeping giant here, and we can talk about how that could impact the Yankees in a little bit, but the fact is, they could use a hitter like Springer. And I'm not saying the Mets couldn't, but the Mets have a very dangerous lineup. Don't let the runners in scoring position, that's not scaring me for this season. I don't think that's going to carry over from that shortened season to this one. They need a guy who can hit in the top of the order, someone who has power, someone who has an incredible on-base percentage. The Mets have a very potent offense. So I think the Blue Jays were very motivated there. The other thing is the clubhouse leader. You have a lot of young guys who are in Toronto. They're trying to still form their identity. I think they needed Springer, someone who has postseason experience, someone who's been through the wars before, and to really galvanize that team and to kind of show them the way. The Mets don't need that. The Mets have Lindor now, number one. You've got other leaders on this team like Dom Smith and Pete Alonso, who granted haven't had the postseason success, but you have really high character guys on the Mets. That appears to be a good clubhouse. Not saying Toronto's not, but I think they coveted the leadership qualities for Springer, whereas I think the Mets already have leaders in their clubhouse, and I think they have a solid crew there.
Sure, they have those leaders, but they only have 2 outfilders. I mean, as you sit right now, the Mets have got Michael Conforto and Brandon.
I don't think that's how it's going to be between now and spring training.
I understand, but right now you have 2 outfielders on this team. Sandy Alderson already came out and said Dom Smith's a first baseman. He said we only have 2 outfielders. It's Conforto and Brandon Nimmo. That's all they have, and they don't have a center fielder. So I'm losing out, and everything you say about Toronto is true. But everything the Mets felt about George Springer should not have changed after the acquisition of Francisco Lindor. And, you look at the financial aspect of this. And John Harper, who's a friend of the program, has hopped on a number of times, sent out a tweet last night after this deal went down. And it's a great tweet because you look at it, basically, Lindor and Cano, salary-wise, is a wash because Cano's suspended for the entire year with the PED use, right? McCann this upcoming year is making the same as Ramos. So the Mets this year have added, in payroll, $8 million on May, $12 million on Carrasco, $9 million on Stroman.
For 2021.
For 2021, right. I'm talking about for 2021.
But Lindor's going to be $300 million starting in 2022.
But that is an if. That is not a certainty, right? The Mets said they were comfortable making that trade for Francisco Lindor if it was just a one-year deal. So we have to see where Lindor is, where the Mets are, and I agree with you. I fully expect the Mets to sign Francisco Lindor to a long-term deal, but there was none of those discussions before that trade was made. Lindor said he wants a feeling-out process for the organization. The Mets have said they want a feeling-out process. They want to sign him. He's a top-5 player in the sport, but both sides have to come to an agreement, right? In Cleveland, Lindor was at $200 million and was at $300 million, and Cleveland as an organization was at $200 million. So that is a significant gap. I just look at it and say we went into this offseason where you have an owner that's worth, $14.5 billion in Steve Cohen. We talked about how much money he was willing to spend. They didn't get the top catcher on the market. They decided to go with James McCann, which I had no issue with because JT Realmuto at that time was not willing to play ball with the Mets. So that's fine. They decided not to pursue Trevor Bauer because they acquired Carrasco in the Lindor deal. But now I'm looking at the financial commitment for George Springer, where he would solidify center field. He's a remarkably clutch player. Everything you said about his leadership qualities are true. You can always use more leaders. Yes, maybe Toronto could have used him a little bit more than the Mets. That's a fair point, but he's a great guy and a good player and a great player, sure, even if he's on the other side of 30. So I'm willing to go to 125 for Springer, but not for 150. Okay, now I'm going to plug Jackie Bradley Jr. in there, who hit, under 230 2 years ago during a full MLB regular season. I think he hit 225 the year before that. He hit 239. It's been a long time since Jackie Bradley Jr. I think it's been 6 years since he had 26 home runs and had 87 RBI for the Boston Red Sox. He's an all-defensive first center fielder, so that's where now I'm going to go and plug and play my center fielder, a guy that's going to be a platoon center fielder when I had the opportunity to add an impact player, and I decided not to pay an additional $5 million per year, because I would assume that George Springer would be willing to go to the Mets more so than the Toronto Bluejays. If the offers were equal, I would imagine he'd want to come to the Mets more than Toronto.
Maybe. I mean, we'll never know that, obviously, but I just think that there's a million ways to do this, and having now that money that you would have put towards Springer to spread it around for the Mets, I think is a sound strategy. I mean, yeah, you could have Springer there, and he'll be in center field for a couple of years, and then he's going to have to move to a corner outfield position, but yes, you would have him there for 2021. You could plug and play, no doubt about that. But I also understand that while for 2021, maybe the Mets aren't going to blow through the luxury tax, and maybe that's what we expected, and it was going to be like the Yankees before 2009, and they were just going to be like, well, be damned, like, we got to sign them all, and just bring everyone. I do kind of understand this approach. It's not blowing everyone away with every last free agent, but they're not done yet. So this still could be an extremely strong team. Like, I'm looking at Jackie Bradley, and I'm looking at him defensively. I mean, you could say the same thing about James McCann. They didn't get the better hitter and the better combination catcher in JT Realmuto, but they felt like they had a guy who was going to fit their organization, and it was on their timeline. So, you know what? Considering they're not done, I can't kill the Mets for this one. I really can't.
Well, but you bring up
Let's
the catching
see how
spot.
it looks, because they need bullpen depth. I mean, there's a lot more to do. You mentioned it, 2 outfielders. I mean, they need some more depth on this team because they don't want Dom Smith playing in left, and I don't know how they feel about J.D. Davis in left, and you want McNeil to be able to play his natural position in second. So they need a lot.
No, they do, but you would have added an all-star and a great player and a clutch player and a great playoff performer in George Springer, and you missed out on him by $25 million for an owner that's worth $14.5 billion and a guy that the Mets into free agency, according to all insiders, was their top target. And they lost him to the Toronto Bluejays for $5 million a year. I mean, extra $5 million, a little less than $5 million per year on average, with Springer getting 6 for $150 from Toronto. Listen, you can allocate that money.
Hold on one second about I know insiders were saying that the Mets were linked to George Springer, but do we have to revisit that considering what we know now? They were after Lindor. They said that started right after the season
ended. I'm talking about free
agency
target. I'm talking about top free agency targets.
I'm just saying what their offseason plans were.
Right.
That's Lindor. I see Lindor almost as more like a free agent signing because it's so imperative that you get him signed to that long-term deal. And it was, you had to trade, obviously, to give up for, you had to give up to get. But I almost see it as that because he's going to command that kind of contract.
I understand. I know. I get the acquisition. No one's knocking, but you can do both. I mean, I brought up they haven't added significant payroll to the team. They haven't.
For 2021.
For 21, right. And that's what I'm looking at because everything else in the future is an if. Conforto's an if, Lindor is an if. I'm looking at cost certainty for 2021. You're looking at it, they have not added anything significant. May's 8, Carrasco's 12, and Stroman is 9, right? Okay. So, I mean, that's where you're sitting at right now. So, if you do a little bit of quick math, that's $29 million, right? Did
you add McCann in there?
I mean, McCann and Ramos are a wash. McCann and Ramos are a wash. Lindor and Cano is a wash. So I'm looking at it, maybe $1 million difference here or there. So say they've added $30 million, maybe $30.5 million of payroll for 2021. I just don't want to hear the rationalization. Well, we didn't pursue Springer and we didn't go all in on Springer because, we want to be players for Michael Conforto. Well, you should be players for Michael Conforto because he's a really good player and you've got an owner that wants to treat this team like a major market team. So the Conforto argument should not be one from my standpoint, from my vantage point. And you're right, Maggie, they can go in different ways. You could add Jackie Bradley Jr., but you have to understand the limitations of him as a player as well and where he is offensively. And, yes, they can go sign Brad Hand. And Rosenthal had the report earlier in the week that the deal was done, then walked that tweet back and said that they were close. They've been in on Brad Hand for a while here. So there's other ways to spend the money and allocate those finances. But, I was disappointed. I thought Springer would have been the ultimate final piece for this team, a natural center fielder, a guy that's an everyday player. Great guy, clutch player, and the Toronto Blue Jays end up getting their star at 6 for $150.